On a cold fall morning in 2021, a surveillance camera captured this footage outside of a house in Ocean County, New Jersey. As you can see, the video is of what appears to be a man walking through the yard of an adjacent property and kind of awkwardly climbing a fence before walking away. Now, at the time this was filmed, nothing about this would have seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, other than this camera, no one actually witnessed the mysterious person leaving that morning. Well, the context of this short clip would completely change just a few days later when police were called to that same neighboring house. What they found there was unbelievably disturbing. And as investigators would soon discover, that footage you just watched was one of the best hopes they had of figuring out what had happened. Settle in, folks, because today's case is one of those that really makes you question human nature. It's a story of greed, betrayal, and just how far some people are willing to go to satisfy their appetite for revenge. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. In late September of 2021, things were quieting down for most residents of Surf City, New Jersey. For those unfamiliar, Surf City is on Long Beach Island, which is one of the islands along the state's famous Jersey Shore. And, like many beach towns, it's bustling in the summer months. By this point of the year, though, most people are preparing for the off-season, bringing in their boats, closing up their beach houses, and just generally getting ready to leave town for the winter. However, for one Surf City couple, that fall was different. 87-year-old John Enders and 75-year-old Francoise Pitoy were getting ready to say goodbye to Long Beach Island permanently. John and Francoise, better known to friends as Jack and Frenchy, were not married. In fact, they hadn't met each other until fairly late in life. But by now, they had been together for about 20 years. And for a lot of that time, they had lived in Jack's beautiful 6-bedroom oceanfront home that backed right onto the waters of Manahawkin Bay. Jack and Frenchy's relationship is actually a pretty cute story. Honestly, it almost feels like it could have been pulled from the pages of a movie script. You know, two people from completely different backgrounds who weren't exactly looking for love, but who happened to come across each other at exactly the right time. The two of them met in 2001, when Frenchy was 55 and Jack was 67. At the time, Frenchy was divorced and she was getting close to retirement. She was spending every spare weekend she had down at the beach, which is where she came across Jack. In a lot of ways, Frenchy and Jack seemed like they couldn't have been more different. Frenchy was originally from France and spoke with a strong accent, hence the nickname. She'd come to the US after marrying her ex-husband, who was in the military. The pair had 2 daughters together, Valerie and Sandrine, but the marriage fell apart when the girls were in their teens. In the years that followed, Frenchy had mostly focused on continuing to raise the girls and worked hard to support them and herself financially. Starting in the mid-1980s, she worked at a nursing home, where she was very well liked, especially by the people in her care. According to Frenchy's close friend, Pam Holmes, who also worked there, you always knew who Frenchy's patients were because they absolutely adored her, and they'd always have a bit of her signature red lipstick on their cheeks from where she had kissed them. Jack, meanwhile, grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, in a borough called Doylestown. After high school, he joined the Air Force and served during the Korean War. He went on to obtain a degree in mechanical engineering and ended up in the construction industry. For most of his adult life, John was married to a woman named Della Ferguson. John and Della had 2 daughters together named Sherry and Terry, and they stayed together right up until Della passed away from early onset Alzheimer's disease. According to those close to Jack, when Della got sick, he dropped everything to take care of her. He continued this day in and day out, spending every precious moment he could with her right up until her death. When Jack and Frenchy met each other that day on the beach in 2001, all of this was still fairly recent. And as you can imagine, Jack was in a very tough place emotionally. But because of her years of work in nursing homes, Frenchy really empathized with Jack in a way that not a lot of other people could. She understood what this disease was and what he had been through. The two of them formed a nearly instant connection, and from basically that point on, they were inseparable. As their romance blossomed, Jack and Frenchy quickly realized that they had quite a few other things in common as well. They both had 2 daughters, and they were proud grandparents. This was particularly true of Frenchy. From the sounds of it, she was your classic grandma, always wanting to be around her grandkids and spoiling the hell out of them every chance she got. Unfortunately, something else Jack and Frenchy shared was a somewhat difficult family situation. Both of them were estranged from one of their daughters. In Frenchy's case, it was Sandrine, and in Jack's case, it was Terry. That being said, it seems like they tried to let this affect their relationships with other family members as little as possible. For instance, Jack was still quite close with Terry's son, his grandson Andrew, and Frenchy was very involved in the life of her daughter Valerie. Valerie lived in Virginia Beach, but she and her mom talked on the phone almost every day. So yeah, for nearly 2 decades, Jack and Frenchy had built this wonderful life together. They spent their retirements enjoying the company of friends and family and just hanging out on the water, fishing and boating during the summertime. By 2021, though, Jack was in his late 80s, and as much as he and Frenchy loved their lives in Surf City, they knew it was time for a change. Jack's beach house was massive, and the upkeep was nearly impossible for 2 older people, so Jack made the decision to put the house on the market. Obviously, this was difficult, but at the same time, he and Frenchy knew it was for the best. It was also a little bit exciting. The money from the sale would allow them to basically spend their twilight years wherever they wanted to. By late September, the couple were pretty sure they had found a buyer, and things were moving along. Enough that Frenchy called her daughter Valerie on September 24th and said they were expecting a closing date sometime in early October. She told Valerie that it was going to be a big move and that she and Jack would likely need some help. Valerie said that was no problem and that all she needed to do was let her know when. Over the next few days, Valerie kept waiting for her mom to reach out, but strangely, she didn't hear from her. Well, sadly, as she was about to find out, that call was never going to come. Just over a week after that phone conversation about Jack and Frenchy's upcoming move, Valerie was feeling uneasy. She still hadn't heard anything from her mom, and over the last couple of days, she'd actually tried calling her several times, but had received no answer. At first, Valerie tried to convince herself that her mom and Jack were just busy. After all, they had lots to do to get ready for the upcoming sale. But at the same time, it was very unlike Frenchy not to return her calls. By the evening of October 2nd, Valerie was concerned enough that she decided to see if she could get in contact with Jack instead. She called his cell phone, and the call was picked up, but when it was, she was greeted by a woman's voice she didn't recognize on the other end. The woman said that she was one of Jack's daughters, and that this was an old number of his. She explained that she also hadn't heard from her father in a few days, but that her son had spoken to him recently, and she could give Valerie his new contact information. She sent it in a text after their conversation, and the two of them exchanged a couple of messages. Valerie tried calling this new number, but it turned out that it didn't work. In fact, alarmingly, the number wasn't even in service. By the next day, so October 3rd, Valerie decided she had to do something. She called up her mom's friend Pam. After telling Pam what was going on, she suggested that Valerie call the Surf City police and ask them to conduct a welfare check. Valerie agreed and contacted the police department shortly before 2 p.m. They sent out a couple of officers to Jack's beach house. When the officers arrived, initially everything seemed to be normal. The house looked totally fine, and there didn't appear to be any broken windows, signs of forced entry, or anything like that. However, police also didn't get an answer when they knocked at the front door. And that was weird, because they could see that Jack's pickup truck was right there parked outside. Deciding to investigate a little further, one of the officers walked around to the rear of the property to see if he could get a better look through one of the large windows there. And that's when he saw it. Inside, in one of the main ground floor rooms, was what appeared to be someone slumped over in a chair, covered in a pile of laundry. The officer forced his way in using a pry bar, and immediately he was hit with the overwhelming smell of decomposition. But That was just the beginning of what awaited police inside. Unlike the exterior of the house, as soon as officers actually went into the residence, they knew that this was a crime scene. There was blood all over the place. The walls, the floors, the appliances, almost everywhere they looked. And it wasn't long before everyone's worst fears were proven correct. When investigators arrived and went over to that chair the first officer had seen, they discovered that the person underneath the pile of laundry was Jack Enders. Jack wasn't wearing any clothing. He had sustained stabbing and slashing injuries all over his body, and it was obvious he had been dead for some time. Things only got worse, though. Moments later, detectives found the remains of a second person. Frenchy was curled up, almost in the fetal position, near the bottom of a set of steps leading upstairs. She was lying in a pool of blood and had suffered very similar wounds to Jack. It looked like she had also been dead for a while. Speaking of the staircase, as authorities were over there, they got their first real clue as to what had happened here. There was a trail of blood on the walls and railing going up the steps, and when investigators followed it, they were led to the master bedroom. One look was enough to confirm that this is where the murders began. Just like downstairs, the scene was awful. There was blood on the floor and all of the bedding, and there were more than a dozen slices in the sheets from where they'd been stabbed and slashed at with a knife. So yeah, Jack and Frenchy had been attacked while they were asleep in bed. The final things detectives recovered from the room were 2 9mm shell casings. These were found under the bed and tucked into the comforter, and it would later be determined they had been fired from a Glock 17 handgun. Taking all of these details in, investigators came up with an off-the-cuff theory. They wondered if this was some kind of burglary gone wrong. Now, this sort of made sense. As I mentioned before, summer was over, so a lot of people who owned beach houses in Surf City had already left for the year. Perhaps an opportunistic thief had assumed that Jack's house would be an easy target, not knowing that he and Frenchy lived there year-round. The idea was maybe this person broke in, only discovered the home was occupied after the fact, and things went horribly sideways. But very quickly, there were serious reasons to doubt this. For starters, if you'll recall, there were no signs of a break-in at the house. All of the doors and windows were also locked when police got there. And more importantly, nothing inside actually appeared to have been stolen. For example, Jack's wallet was found in the kitchen with plenty of money inside, and a safe in an upstairs closet containing more cash and jewelry was likewise untouched. The burglary theory seemed even less credible as authorities continued to take a closer look at the blood evidence throughout the house. From the looks of it, the killer had gotten a substantial amount of this blood on themselves during the attacks, enough that they had left behind numerous bare footprints at the scene, as well as fingerprints and palm prints on several doorknobs. Not only was this careless, it suggested that the killer had lingered at the home after committing the murders. Additional evidence of this was found in one of the bathrooms, where it appeared that they had tried to wash themselves off in a sink and may have used a hairdryer. To detectives, all of this demonstrated that the perpetrator had some level of familiarity with the crime scene. If that were the case, though, it meant that the killer was almost certainly someone that Jack and Frenchy knew. And authorities would only become more convinced of this when they later received the results of their autopsies. The findings showed that Jack and Frenchy had each died from multiple critical knife wounds. Frenchy had suffered 39 such injuries, while Jack had been stabbed and slashed a staggering 51 times. That wasn't all, though. It turned out that both of them had been shot. These gunshots were not fatal, though. The bullets that struck them had hit them in the mouth. In other words, the killer wanted them to suffer. And based on the way that Jack was found, sitting up in that chair, detectives concluded they likely wanted them to know who was responsible as well. This was a chilling thought, but of course the question was, who would do something like this? And why? There was another problem too. You see, despite all of the evidence at the scene, based on the autopsies, it was determined that Jack and Frenchy had been dead for several days by the time they were found. This meant that the killer had a massive head start, putting police at a significant disadvantage. Well, As it happened, detectives still had not yet found their most valuable piece of evidence. That piece of evidence would not come from inside the house, though. It would come from outside. It didn't take long for news to spread that something was going on at Jack's beach house. Authorities still weren't sharing a lot of details with the public, but understandably, when locals saw police swarming around the place that afternoon, they knew something bad was happening. This became even more obvious when forensic technicians moved from the crime scene in the house and began looking for additional evidence outside. And it was here that they soon found another clue. On one of the back corners of the fence surrounding Jack's property, the technician spotted more blood. It was a small amount, but it stood out because of the color contrast with the white fence. Testing would later reveal that the blood belonged to Frenchy, and detectives suspected that it had been left behind by the killer as they were fleeing the scene. By the following morning, so October 4th, the double homicide was officially reported in some local media.
This bayfront home was where the bodies of the couple were discovered on October 3rd.
Surf City police are investigating the deaths of two people found inside a home on North 7th Avenue. Ocean County prosecutors say at this time the deaths are considered suspicious.
The crime came as a major shock to residents. This was not the kind of thing people were used to in this area, especially not at a luxury beach house. But the publicity turned out to be helpful, particularly when Surf City and Ocean County police were provided with two vital pieces of information. The first came when investigators were contacted by two women named Geraldine Grime and Judith Miller. Geraldine and Judith said that they were longtime friends of Jack and Frenchy's and explained that they had actually tried to visit them a few days ago. They'd even called ahead on the evening of September 28th and had spoken to Jack. During that conversation, they told him they were briefly coming into town the next day on their way to see other relatives and said they were thinking about stopping by. Jack said that would be great. Frenchy might have to briefly run out to an appointment, but he was planning to be at home all day. When Geraldine and Judith got there around 10 o'clock the following morning, though, they got no answer when they knocked at Jack's front door. They waited for about 20 minutes, but eventually they decided there had obviously been some kind of miscommunication, so they left. This helped to narrow the timeline of the murders significantly. Jack and Frenchy were clearly alive and well on the evening of September 28th, but by the next morning they had stopped answering their door and responding to calls. Detectives concluded that they had likely been killed sometime overnight, possibly in the early hours of September 29th. It was the second piece of information that police received, though, that really helped to bring a lot of the evidence in the case together. It came from Jack's next-door neighbor, who informed them about an outdoor surveillance system he had set up on his property. The system was comprised of multiple cameras, one of which happened to have a partial view of the back of Jack's house as well. When police obtained the footage and started going through it, what they found was equally compelling and unnerving. Video from the morning of September 29th had captured a person walking through Jack's backyard at 6:41 a.m. As you can see, the person headed for the back corner, climbing over the fence in the exact spot where that blood evidence had been recovered. There was no doubt in detectives' minds. This was their killer. Additional footage captured by the neighbors' cameras, as well as a few others in the area, showed that after leaving the crime scene, the suspect began walking along North 6th Street. They were headed east towards Long Beach Boulevard, which is the island's main road. Unfortunately, as helpful as this lead was, this is sort of where the trail ended. And as you just saw, at no point in the footage was the suspect's face or really any of their identifying features visible. The killer appeared to be dressed in a large blue coat and pants and was carrying some sort of yellow raincoat. The most investigators could say is that the suspect looked like a man. Hoping to find more, police continued canvassing the surrounding area, searching for additional surveillance footage. In the meantime, though, they decided that in order to understand the motive behind the crime, they needed to learn more about what was going on in Jack and Frenchy's lives at the time of their murders. And that meant some uncomfortable questions for their grieving loved ones. Especially because, let's remember, detectives now suspected the couple were killed by someone they knew. At first, basically everyone, including Valerie, said that they couldn't think of anyone who would do something like this. Jack and Frenchy didn't have any enemies people were aware of, and they certainly weren't involved in anything illegal or dangerous. They were a pair of retirees looking forward to the next chapter of their lives. However, things started to shift when investigators found out about Jack's strained relationship with his daughter, Terry. They thought this was significant, particularly because of the timing of the murders coinciding with the sale of Jack's house. It turned out the house was going to provide quite the financial windfall for Jack. He had fully paid off the mortgage on it years ago, and the place was now worth around $1.9 million. Now, obviously, that's a lot of money, but things got even more interesting when detectives took a look at Jack's will. You see, it had been changed recently, only a couple of months ago, in fact, and the person who now stood to inherit basically all of Jack's estate, it was his 30-year-old grandson, Andrew Vero. As I mentioned before, Andrew was Terry's son, so naturally investigators felt that there might be something going on here. But before they could even begin tracking Andrew down for questioning, he reached out to them. When detectives were contacted by Andrew Vero, needless to say, they were both surprised and a little suspicious. At this point, they still hadn't even finished reaching out to all of Jack and Frenchy's immediate family members to let them know what had happened. But Andrew said this is actually why he was calling. His friend had sent him a post on Facebook they'd come across that included a photo of police at the crime scene. Andrew stated that he recognized his grandfather's beach house, and that's why he was reaching out. Given what they now knew, investigators took this opportunity to question Andrew, specifically about the dynamics between Jack and other members of the family, including his mother Terry. Andrew explained that his mom and his grandfather had been estranged for about 20 years, starting when he was just a kid. Around that time, there was a bad divorce in the family, and people had kind of chosen sides. The situation got toxic, and sadly, things had never been the same since. Andrew clarified, though, that he was very close with his grandfather. He saw him fairly regularly, and Jack was very much a father figure to him. Losing him was absolutely devastating, and in such an awful way, too. From the sounds of it, police chose not to confront Andrew about their suspicions directly during this call. But from his statements, it was clear he wanted them to believe that neither he nor his mom were involved in what had happened. There was something else that caught investigators' attention, too. When the subject of Jack's will came up, Andrew sounded very surprised to learn that he was the primary beneficiary of his grandfather's estate. Of course, he could have been faking this, so detectives didn't really know what to make of the whole thing one way or the other. Luckily, though, they wouldn't be left in the dark for long, because it was then that they received an update from that team that had been out canvassing for additional surveillance video. And what they found would completely change the direction of the case. It started when the canvassing team was able to obtain further home security footage from another one of Jack's neighbors, this time one street over on North 7th Street. This is where the entrance to Jack's beach house was actually located, and it was the road you would take if you were driving there. When police reviewed video from a camera at this neighbor's home, they realized it had caught additional footage of the suspect. At 4:58 a.m. on September 29th, a large vehicle was captured driving past and parking outside of Jack's home. About an hour later, at 5:48 a.m., it could be seen driving back in the opposite direction. Approximately 5 minutes after that, the camera recorded one other bit of footage that stood out. It's kind of hard to see because of how dark it was at the time this was filmed, but if you look closely, you can just make out a person walking towards Jack's beach house. Police were convinced that this was the killer, and it lined up with everything else they had uncovered so far. Combining all of the footage together, detectives concluded that the suspect had initially staked out the crime scene before parking their vehicle a short distance away, either on or close to Long Beach Boulevard. They then walked back, entering the house around 5:53 a.m. This would have given them plenty of time to commit the murders before partially cleaning themselves off and fleeing back to their vehicle just under an hour later at 6:41 a.m. Speaking of the suspect's vehicle, This is where things got really interesting. Because even though the surveillance video was grainy, authorities were able to determine the vehicle's make and model. It was an early 2000s Ford Winnebago Mini, a type of motorhome manufactured by Winnebago and built on a Ford chassis. Not only was this vehicle quite distinctive, now that investigators knew the suspect was driving, there was something else they were able to take advantage of: geography. Long Beach Island is, well, it's an island, and if you're driving there, there's only one way on or off: the Manahawkin Bay Bridge. The bridge and surrounding highway ramps have a number of traffic cameras on them, and when detectives took a look at the footage from the morning of the murders, sure enough, it wasn't hard to find what they were looking for. The killer's Winnebago was caught on video arriving on the island at 4:48 a.m., 10 minutes before it pulled up outside of Jack's beach house. It was recorded again as it was leaving at 6:58 a.m., so 17 minutes after that video of the suspect climbing over the fence. Now, this in and of itself was huge, but there was still one last thing detectives were able to learn from this line of investigation. You see, the Manahawkin Bay Bridge isn't just equipped with traffic cameras. It also has automated license plate readers, and they had managed to pick up the information from the suspect's Winnebago on the morning of September 29th. When detectives ran that information, though, and saw who the vehicle was registered to, let's just say they were in for a bit of a surprise, because it didn't belong to Andrew Vero or even his mother Terry. Its owner was Jack Enders' other daughter, Sherry Heffernan. As shocking as this revelation was, it wasn't entirely unprecedented. And that's because there's something I haven't told you. Remember that phone call that Valerie had? The one with the woman who said she was Jack's daughter? Well, that conversation was with Sherry. So her name had come up in the case. It's just that up until now, no one had seriously considered her a suspect. This made sense because on the surface, Sherry Heffernan had no motive. By all accounts, she was educated, successful, and she wasn't in any kind of financial trouble. Sherry was 55 years old and lived a couple of hours away in Landenberg, Pennsylvania, with her 22-year-old son, JJ. For most of her adult life, she'd been quite an achiever. Sherry had bachelor's degrees in economics and business, as well as a master's from LaSalle University. She was also a certified financial planner and had her real estate license in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania. These accomplishments had allowed Sherry to have a series of lucrative jobs throughout her professional career, including, at one point, being an assistant vice president for Prudential Insurance. In 2013, Sherry had to stop working due to a disability, but because of those good jobs she'd managed to save plenty of money, enough that she was still living comfortably and wasn't at all worried about being able to pay her bills. So yeah, this is why Sherry wasn't really on the radar when police first started investigating, especially because they'd been told that Terry was the one who was estranged from Jack. Well, as it turned out, things weren't exactly peachy between Jack and Sherry either. When detectives spoke to some of Jack's friends, they learned that while Sherry was still in her dad's life, they were at each other's throats constantly. They were always arguing about one thing or another, and recently, things had turned particularly nasty. It started earlier that year, when Jack first informed Sherry he wanted to sell the beach house. Sherry apparently viewed this as a slap in the face, because she had always assumed that the entire property was just going to be given to her. Jack told her no, that wasn't going to happen, but this was still an opportunity for her. Because Sherry was a real estate agent, he allowed her to handle the listing for the property, meaning she stood to make a good amount of money off the sale of the house. However, things had not gone as planned. Sherry was not able to find a buyer, and after a while, Jack got frustrated. He felt like Sherry wasn't putting in the work, so eventually he kicked her off the listing and gave it to another agent. This definitely seemed like a possible motive to detectives, but they still wondered, what about that person in the surveillance video? I mean, up until now, they'd assumed it was a man. Upon taking another look at the video, though, investigators weren't so sure. The clothing the killer was wearing was quite oversized, so it was really difficult to say one way or the other. Thankfully, that's where the fence proved to be useful once again. By comparing the posts to the person in the footage, they were able to determine the height of the suspect, approximately 5 feet 8 inches. This height and body shape did not match Andrew, Terry, or any of the other people police had previously considered. But you know who it did match? Sherry Heffernan. With Sherry now considered the prime suspect, a couple of Ocean County detectives headed to Pennsylvania. They also contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and asked them to keep an eye on Sherry's home. When they saw someone leaving in a truck, they followed, before pulling the vehicle over for a minor traffic violation. It turned out Sherry was not behind the wheel. It was her son, JJ, but he agreed to speak with detectives, and during that conversation revealed more important details. JJ confirmed that his mom still had the Winnebago that had been connected to the murders. He also told them that she was the only person who drove it, and that she had left in the motorhome suddenly in the middle of the night a few days earlier. That was the same day that Jack and Frenchy were killed. JJ also ended up revealing more about Sherry's relationship with her father and his girlfriend. He said that he and his mom thought Frenchy was a gold digger and blamed her for Jack wanting to sell the Surf City beach house. Following this discussion, authorities felt that they had enough to prove that Sherry was the killer, and that she was the person they'd seen in all of that surveillance footage. They moved in and arrested her on October 4th, just one day after Jack and Frenchy's bodies were found. While Sherry immediately asked for a lawyer upon being taken into custody and refused to answer any questions, because of what they'd uncovered, police were able to obtain warrants for both her home and vehicles. Sherry's house specifically ended up being a goldmine of additional evidence. For starters, she had a sizable gun collection. Noticeably absent from that collection was a Glock 17 handgun, but what detectives were able to find was a receipt for that exact weapon. The next thing investigators found was a copy of Jack's will, which was sitting out in the open on a dining room table. The will potentially explained another big part of the motive. This was an old copy of the will from before Jack's recent change, and in this version, Sherry stood to inherit a sizable amount of her father's estate. Even more incriminating, though, was Sherry's cell phone and her own home surveillance system. By combining the footage and location information from the phone, police were able to completely map out the journey she had taken to and from the crime scene on the day of the murders. All of it completely lined up with the other video evidence they already had, with Sherry's phone showing that she was at Jack's house at the same time he and Frenchy were killed. By far, the most disturbing clue found in the house, though, was a digital camera. When detectives started going through it, they saw that it was full of photos of both the inside and outside of Jack Enders' home. Chillingly, those photos had been taken just 2 days before Jack and Frenchy were killed. The photos were quite thorough and had captured basically a complete layout of the property. Sure enough, when detectives went back to the original surveillance footage they'd gotten from Jack's neighbor and rewound a little further, there was Sherry on the morning of September 27th. When that video was played side by side with the one of the suspect, the similarity was undeniable. Police theorized that this was Sherry casing her own father's house and staking it out so that she would know exactly what she wanted to do when she came back to carry out the killings. At this point, Sherry Heffernan was charged with 2 counts of murder, as well as multiple weapons offenses. But despite all of the incriminating evidence, she denied any wrongdoing. If you're wondering how that could possibly be the case, well, here was her story. She was simply out taking pictures on the morning of September 27th. The timing was just a coincidence. And as for everything else, she was being framed by her sister and her nephew. Here's Sherry explaining part of this supposed grand conspiracy to a friend in a jailhouse phone call.
This is a prepaid call from
Sherry Heffernan,
an inmate at the Ocean County Jail.
So they have video of the RV at your dad's house?
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
Doesn't mean I was driving it, and it doesn't mean I went in the house.
Right.
You know, this should be on that American Greed show, because it's totally looking like there's this whole scam going on with my sister and Andy trying to get their lottery ticket. I was at the beach for over an hour and a half taking pictures, and people saw me. More importantly, the film is dated.
Right.
They're part of my alibi. I definitely was at the beach.
So yeah, that was Sherry's version of events, and she would go on to stick with this story when she went to trial in February of 2024. Sherry's lawyers also argued that she wasn't physically capable of carrying out the attack because she was disabled. Now listen, far be it from me to question anyone's medical conditions, but let me just read you what she and her lawyers claimed. Keep in mind, they stated this was not an exhaustive list. According to her legal team, Sherry suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, an autoimmune disease, hyperthyroidism, chronic fatigue syndrome, Lyme disease, carpal tunnel, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, a detached retina, eye infections, herniated discs, and narcolepsy. I mean, I don't know about you, but to me, that reads like the side effects disclaimer of a late-night pharmaceutical infomercial. And unfortunately for Sherry, the prosecution was more than prepared for her defense. You see, on top of all of the other evidence I already told you about, by the time the case made it to court, authorities had also been able to do a bunch of testing and analysis of the blood evidence at the crime scene. And all of those footprints, fingerprints, palm prints that had been found by police, they were all a match to Sherry, not Terry or Andrew or anyone else. Prosecutors argued that Sherry meticulously planned and carried out Jack and Frenchy's murders because she was furious about the sale of the house. It was never 100% confirmed if she knew she'd been cut out of her dad's will or not, but what was clear is that she blamed Frenchy, believing that she was stealing her birthright. So on the morning of September 29th, she drove to the beach house in her Winnebago under the cover of darkness and secretly entered the property armed with a knife and gun. After shooting both of them in bed, she began stabbing them in a horrifying and frenzied attack. But this was not the end of things, because as prosecutors argued, Sherry wanted her dad and Frenchy to suffer. So she marched Jack downstairs into that chair, where she forced him to sit down and look her in the eyes while she murdered him. As for Frenchy, prosecutors said they believed that she also survived the initial attack and began desperately trying to crawl to safety, but she only made it to the bottom of the stairs before Sherry saw her and finished her off as well. After brutally killing them both, Sherry cleaned up as best she could, then drove back home as if nothing had happened. Again, it's not super clear whether Sherry knew all of the details of the will or if she still believed she'd be getting some kind of inheritance. But of course, either way, the irony is that the person that she blamed, Frenchy, was not the person in line to benefit from Jack's estate. Andrew was the one who was going to get everything. At the end of the 4-week trial, Sherry was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as multiple counts of possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose. On May 10th, 2024, she was handed 2 life sentences for the murders. Those sentences are set to run consecutively, and state prison records list Sherry's mandatory minimum term as just under 64 years. Given that, it's unlikely she will ever be released. She appealed her conviction, but that appeal was denied earlier this year. At the time of this recording, Sherry Heffernan remains incarcerated at the Edna Man Correctional Facility in Union Township, New Jersey. I don't think there's really any loose ends with this one, but one thing I did want to mention is that Sherry apparently continues to maintain her innocence. In fact, when given the chance to speak before her sentencing, she said, quote, "I really wish I was the one who was killed, that I was the one who died. This is horrible pain. It's horrible to lose people you love and then be blamed for it. They were priceless people, both my dad and Francoise. I will forever miss them. That's all I can say. Just sad." So yeah, even now, Sherry is still playing the victim. But that being said, it seems her sentencing did bring some comfort to Jack and Frenchy's loved ones. Following the guilty verdict, Valerie told reporters, quote, "Prayers do work." Andrew, meanwhile, said, quote, "It's pure relief, and we can move on now." Speaking of moving on, it seems Andrew did inherit Jack's estate, but everything was placed in a trust for him until he is 40. I can only imagine, though, that he'd gladly give it all up if it meant having his grandfather back. And that's really the saddest part of all of this. Given their ages, Jack and Frenchy probably only had a few more years together. But those were their years. Years that were stolen from them and their loved ones, all because of a callous and pointless act of selfishness and greed. Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, one of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.